The Addolorata Cemetery is one of those underrated sites which many often associate with dark hours. However, the cemetery is also a place which is rich in history and art. This new book on the Addolorata Cemetery brought together a number of scholars to discuss and research the site. With us today, I'd like to present Professor Conrad Thake, the editor of the book, and the other contributors, Mr. Mario Borch, Dr. Mark Sagona, Mr. James Leakery, and there was also the work of the photographer, Dr. Charles Paul Azzopardi. Conrad, what is the significance of the Addolorata Cemetery within the Maltese artistic and architectural context?
Well, certainly it rates as one of the most important, I would say, open-air repositories of the arts in Malta during the 19th century. I'll talk a bit about the fact that the project originated from the Department of the History of Art, whereby there was a strong interest in the visual culture of death, particularly arts in its different forms, funerary arts, architecture, sculpture, the decorative arts. So the idea was that cemeteries, unfortunately, historic cemeteries in the 19th century had been almost uncharted territory. There was very little in terms of academic work or publications. There might have been a few articles there and there. So, but undoubtedly, the Addolorata Cemetery, we refer to this as a necropolis, basically signifying polis is a city, state, and necro is dead, a city of the dead, literally. This was a very important milestone, even in the socio-cultural history of Malta, given the fact that in terms of local burials, the Catholic Church had initially been opposed to the principle of extramural burials outside the confines of the parish. So it took quite a while for the Church to accept that there should be interment beyond the confines of the parish church. There had been, in a way, a bit of a test case with another cemetery, Addolorata Cemetery, which was an extramural cemetery, but not, technically speaking, a Catholic cemetery. And by the time that the Addolorata Cemetery was inaugurated in 1869, in fact, almost a week within the opening of the cemetery, the law of extramural interment had been approved. This came around, this has been amply discussed in the book in terms of even developments on the European continent, particularly in France, where in view of the need as well to improve public sanitation and municipal health, the idea of establishing cemeteries outside the urban areas was considered the new way to go. Now, one might think the common denominator of most of these cemeteries, I'm referring to Tabraxia, I'm referring to the Ottoman Muslim cemetery and the Addolorata Cemetery, they were the work of one individual Maltese architect, Emanuele Luigi Galizia. So we owe a lot to Emanuele Luigi Galizia, who in a way was a master in terms of site planning as well. The actual location of the cemetery on the Talhor Hill was also the subject of a lot of discussion with the authorities at the time. In fact, it was not initially the first choice. The first choice was another site where there's the Jesuits Hill near Men'a, but that was vetoed because the military authorities did not want to basically let go of that site for military considerations. So Talhor was the next choice, given its close proximity to Valletta, Floriana, the three cities, the fact it was wasteland, but then it also posed both a challenge and an opportunity to Galizia in terms of planning this cemetery. The fact that it was on a hill, on a slope. Galizia was sent on a study tour, both in England and in France, and he visited various cemeteries. In fact, sometimes they say the Addolorata Cemetery is closely modeled after that of North Cemetery in Paris, something which he himself denied when an important contemporary, Nicholas Ammid, commented on the fact. But obviously, there are influences. Nothing, comes from a vacuum. I mean, there are always ideas come from other projects. But to basically be more direct in answering your question, I would say that in the Addolorata, we have a wide spectrum of funerary monuments, be they chapels, be they standalone sculptural monuments that represent a wide range of art historical movements, neo-Gothic, revival styles, eclectic styles, neoclassical styles, and over there we really have, it is literally an open-air museum. Besides the fact that Galizia was a master in terms of the landscaping. I mean, one can appreciate the way the cemetery is laid out, reaching a climax with the Our Lady of Sorrows Church, the Addolorata Church at the top, in a neo-Gothic style. And the neo-Gothic in Malta was not a natural style. Our natural kind of ethos was the Baroque. But given that he was au courant with the styles on the continent, he also, I think, wanted to present this idea that since this is a necropolis, a city of the dead, that this was a magical place that was not just like any other place on the Maltese territory. So when over time you see this hill overtaken with vegetation, with trees, with shrubs, and then at the pinnacle, at the summit of this hill, there is this spire of this neo-Gothic church, it presents this vision, this image of a place beyond our world of mortals. So I would say that he must have thought it quite fitting, stylistically as well, to model this basically using a neo-Gothic architecture idiom, but also based on the new kind of movements as well of Romanticism, and a garden cemetery, which were things that basically were evolving very much in the 19th century.
Thank you, Conrad. But the book also delves into not just the history of the cemetery, but also projects into ways how this monument can be preserved in time. With us via Zoom is another contributor, James Leakery, a conservator. James, as a professional art restorer, what, in your opinion, are the main challenges facing the preservation of monuments within the Addolorata Cemetery? Oh.
Can I interject? Okay. In order, basically, for this project, we had a team of contributors because we wanted that there will be specializations. So actually, Mario Borch had worked extensively, writing 2 extensive dissertations on this. So that was the backbone of the book. Dr. Mark Sogon actually worked a lot on the decorative arts. And then James Leakery worked a lot on the aspects of management of the cemetery, giving insights as well as to restoration aspects, and maybe he could elaborate a bit further on this.
James? James, are you with us?
Yes,
Did you get the question?
No, I didn't get the question.
All right, fine. Conrad made an introduction into the history of the cemetery. However, the cemetery is also and still is in use today, and it is very important that we see the future of this cemetery. As a professional art restorer and conservator, what is, in your opinion, are the main challenges facing the preservation of monuments within the Addolorata?
Well, based on the stuff that has been published within this book and the extensive research done by my colleagues, it's very obvious that we need to try and project the various values attributed to the cemetery to the future, as you're putting it. One of the main challenges is obviously the functionality, that It is a cemetery that is still functional and hopefully will remain functional. Apart from the other problems related to maintenance, which hopefully will be tackled regarding the various public spaces, but one must keep in mind that most monuments and most tombs were private, and therefore the responsibility for the upkeep and maintenance generally falls onto the private individual. Another challenging issue is normally regarding the environment and ecosystem within the cemetery, because we will be talking about the various monuments and artistic value and historical architectural value. But one must keep in mind that it was planned as a garden cemetery. And the aspect of it being a garden must be also respected and conserved. But there's always that challenge. Do we preserve the tree or do we cut it down because its roots are affecting the monument? So these are challenges that are referred to and discussed also within the book. Other than that, the other challenges are obviously to try and preserve various aspects which are sometimes unseen. Conrad mentioned the aspect of the architectural plan and the vision of the cemetery. And one must keep in mind that Galizia was also very specialized on the engineering aspect, for example, on preventing the cemetery from flooding. So there are various other aspects that one must consider for the preservation of the cemetery for the future.
Thank you, James. Mario, what was the context regarding the formation of the Addolorata Cemetery, with specific reference to the law of extramural interment?
Well, to begin with, during the 19th century, we come across instances, particularly within the three cities, Valletta, for example, where epidemics take place. Why? Because people are buried within the church structures themselves. There is an emission of decompositional material, and all of a sudden you get people getting sick, falling ill, and dying. So this whole issue of epidemics happening one place today, another place, another town, another day, had to lead to some drastic action. And the action was to bury the dead outside the city of the living. This was not something that was happening just locally. Locally, when compared perhaps to European standard, it took place a bit later in time. Why? Because we already see that in 1804, the French had already taken this drastic decision to move outside the city of Paris in the famous Père Lachaise, and then there was the Cimetière de Montmartre and the other, the Montparnasse as well. And in those days, those cemeteries were outside the city. So this wave of extramural burial in Europe was happening as of the early 1800s, 19th century. 1804 was the first cemetery within Europe in Père Lachaise in Paris. After that, we have other cities, for example, Liverpool, Torino. We have London with its Kensal Green Cemetery and West Highgate. We even have Liverpool itself having a very important role to play in this. Scotland as well. With the Maltese, initially it was planned on being the Tabraxia Cemetery. But because of disputes between Protestants and Catholics, there had to be a bit of a pause, a halt. More time went by. until eventually in 1862, following what Conrad said about the choice, the location, the new location, sort of equidistant between Valletta and the three cities, the Talhor Hill was chosen as the place predominantly for Catholics to be buried in. Now, with the opening in May 1869, comes along an Ordinance Act. Okay, the Act of 1869, Act 11, Article 36, which specifically then would say that intramural burial was no longer sustainable. And predominantly within the three cities and Valletta, strong measures were taken. They were taken to prevent further contagion, further bad air, what would be referred to as the miasma. Okay? And people had to be enticed. It wasn't very easy, although it was sort of the new law of the land, it wasn't very easy to bring people to move away from these holy spaces, the churches, the parvis of the church themselves, to take them to a place which to them was seen as the place where animals grazed, where there was kind of neglect, so to speak, the back of beyond. And it was very, very hard. So what did the government do in those days to entice people? Well, firstly, people who already owned burial vaults within the church were given other vaults, so to speak, in exchange within the cemeterial grounds. And that was a good incentive. Apart from that, there were also stationed there Capuchin friars to look after the place. Remember, in those days, it would take a long time to reach the place on foot or by cart or whatever. So they actually had their own lodge, the Friars' Lodge. And they had the task of saying Mass for the repose of the souls every day. And there was also this situation where whenever there was a funeral to take place, the bells chimed, even though back then it would be far away from everywhere else, and bells chimed, and little things like this which would entice people to be encouraged to go and eventually allow for a new sacred space to be formed. They would feel comfortable that they are still being buried close to a church, and at the same time, for the government would see the end or a diminution of epidemics happening within the cities of the island itself.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, this new place of burial also needed to be embellished. The sense of belonging of the living extends towards the dead by embellishment. How does the Addolorata Cemetery then fit within the European decorative arts context of the 19th century?
Well, the 19th century is veritably synonymous with the development of the decorative arts. It is the century which emancipated design and decoration and the use of ornament. It is the century of the great exhibitions, of the great exhibition of London. It is the century of the Exposition Universelle de Paris. It is also the century of, as Mario was saying before me, it is the century of the cemetery. And therefore, at the Addolorata, we have this great reflection of the larger international context. The larger international context in design, in the application of ornament. And therefore, this is, for me, the Addolorata, I think it is the most important repository, an open-air repository of decoration and ornament. And in many ways, the Addolorata places Malta on the international map. Like many other great European cities, like Paris, like London, like Milan, Malta has its own great cemetery, a cemetery which is full of funerary monuments, of funerary chapels, and wherever you look, as you enter the cemetery, it's not only the style which is used, which is the prevailing style. The structures speak the Gothic revival language, and the Gothic revival is, in many ways, it is intrinsically related to the 19th century. There is that spirit, and I think here at the Addolorata there is the most palpable feeling of the 19th century. As you enter, as you climb up towards the church, as you go through the labyrinth of monuments of all types and forms, as you go around the chapels with their wrought iron gates and grills, the type of ornament, the kind of carving that we have at the Addolorata. It is so synonymous. It is truly like taking out a page from a design book of the 19th century. And there you have all the great styles or the great design movements of the 19th century, starting from neoclassicism and continuing with the revivalist attitude, wherever you see the 19th century is also synonymous with revivalism. And therefore you have the Gothic revival, you have the Renaissance revival, you have the Baroque revival, you have the Romanesque revival, you have the Egyptian revival. They're all there. And therefore it is so clear that the spirit of the 19th century is there, and this is also the reason because the designers, the architects who were involved, starting from Galizia, continuing with Nicola Zammit, Michele Busuttil the Younger, these were among Malta's topmost designers, and they were truly immersed in this ethos, the ethos of the 19th century. And therefore, Malta is truly placed on the international map because you can compare it to, as Mario said before me, to Père Lachaise, to the Cimetière de Montmartre, the Staglieno Cemetery, the Cimitero Monumentale, or the Verano Cemetery of Rome. And whenever you visit these cemeteries outside Malta, there is the same spirit, and therefore the Addolorata truly places Malta also on a par with the much greater countries of the Mediterranean and Europe. And it also shows how much European the character of decoration and ornament in Malta is. That it is true, even though Malta is an island, even though the geographical situation of Malta is on the periphery of the extreme periphery of Europe, but nonetheless, that didn't affect the country, and the decorative arts, in many ways, they transcend the geographical limitations and place of the Maltese islands, and therefore, yes, truly, I think I don't know of any other place in Malta and Gozo that truly, so eloquently speaks the language of the 19th century. So I think that it is truly a reflection of the spirit of the 19th century.
Thank you, Mark. Conrad, I come back to you. We've so far discussed the history of the architecture, the decorative art, and the preservation of the cemetery. But as an editor, how is the book organized? Also, I'd like to, since he couldn't be with us today, some reference to the photography specifically taken for the book.
Yes. First of all, let me try to put this in context. Well, this is the third in a series of monographs, books on historic cemeteries of the 19th century. I've mentioned the first two were on the Ottoman Muslim cemetery, also by Galizia and Tabraxia. So the format was such that we felt that there was an important need to have a number of papers, first of all dealing with the socio-political, historical development of the cemetery. So as I mentioned before, Mario had worked assiduously on 2 major dissertations. So there was a lot of material that formed the backbone from Mario's original work that obviously we continued to refine and work upon and add on to with other references. So there is another chapter dedicated to the architecture of the funerary chapels, because here we have, as Mark mentioned, such a wide kind of spectrum of styles, but also individual architects. Architects that maybe were not as well known as Emanuele Luigi Galizia, but others that, you know, certainly as well have an important contribution to make. One can mention Nicola Zammit, Andrea Vassallo, Godwin Galizia, the actual son of Emanuele Luigi Galizia, Emanuele Borch. And so all of these, in a way, had a contribution to the architecture of the cemetery. Then there is another chapter that Mario discusses in detail about freestanding monuments. The freestanding monuments mainly, yes, and Mario will elaborate, and these mainly comprise sculptural pieces, ensembles. So we have both the architecture, the funerary chapels, and freestanding monuments. Then there is a chapter by Mark on the decorative arts, ranging from anything like, you know, decorative stonework, wrought iron work. We forgot to mention even stained glass even in the church chapel itself. And all of these are actually fine examples of a very rich artisanal culture in Malta. I mean, because a lot of these, with some exceptions, because in the chapel itself, there were some works the stained glass was mainly imported from overseas, because there wasn't a major local production of stained glass in Malta. But the wrought iron work was a very thriving industry in Malta, even in terms of decorative stonework. So we have to put all of this together. So, I mean, the Addolorata Cemetery required, in a way, the effort of a formidable team of both researchers, academic researchers, and also professional restorers like James. James wrote, his contribution was on the management plan, on aspects like the flora, the fauna, the ecological system, so things that go a bit beyond the artistic legacy of that. We put a number of archival documents, a number of drawings, original drawings, which are in the repository of the National Archives in Malta. And then obviously we had to captivate even the beauty in black and white photography that the photographer, Dr. Charles Paul Azzopardi, managed to communicate. I mean, the beauty, obviously we have to be realistic. I mean, the cemetery is an extensive one. This is not a survey, a gazetteer of every single monument. So some things we have to leave out. But a good representative overview of the cemetery. And in this case, the photographer had a major challenge. He had to actually study the best time when to take a particular photograph, depending both on the weather, the direction of the sunlight direction, other challenges. Maybe you have overgrown vegetation over a monument. So in a way, it was a real collective team effort. And they need then the direction of the editor as well. So in a way, it was both a formidable task, with its challenges. It took something like 3 or 4 years to put it together. So I mean, it comes with obviously a certain degree of, I would say, overlap. But in a way, this could never have been performed by one single individual, because this required various skills. It required a lot of rechecking, discussions. So given the extent of the cemetery and its importance,
we're running out of time. 2 very short comments by Mario and Mark to conclude. One, Mario, Conrad mentioned the freestanding monuments and the chapels. Something on that.
Well, with respect to the freestanding monuments, as James mentioned earlier, This was a place devoted to all categories of society. And so with that, one implies also different means, okay? So you find a mix of sculptors who are involved in the production of these freestanding monuments, some of whom would be very popular, but at the same time their work is sort of grassroots. Amongst them, for example, Vincenzo da Candia, who has an extensive range of monuments which shift from saint statuary to toned down neoclassical structure. And then you have others who are of, so to speak, of a higher caliber, amongst them being Francesco Saverio Shortino, the brother of Antonio Shortino, who in his work speaks a very different language, more of a realist symbolic language, where one of his fortes in his funerary monuments is angels, and the great ability with which he could create angels indicating sorrow, indicating judgment, in bronze, in marble. We also have attributions to people like Filippo Antonio Cifariello, possibly Moschetti, and even Valenti, the latter two having worked in Malta, having been given important commissions in other places, in gardens, in other churches, and seemingly there might be also some of their attributed works over there.
So Mark, how does all this fit in the 19th century decorative art in Malta? Is it the cemetery representative of all this?
Well, the decorative arts, it is a subject which we are still starting to analyze, to study. And the Addolorata Cemetery presents only one facet of this extraordinary production, which Malta was so important for in the 19th century. We have to remember that throughout the 19th century, Malta boasted of some very fine stone sculptors, stone carvers, who are obviously mostly represented at the Addolorata, but not only, because if we are to compare what is happening in the building of churches, or in the remodeling of churches, or in the commissioning of works for churches, you get silver works, you get wood carving, you get embroidery, you get stained glass windows. So the Addolorata is only one facet of the great, extraordinary richness which Malta was producing in the 19th century. In a way, it is also an extension, because some of the designers, we mentioned Nicola Zammit. Nicola Zammit, for me, I consider him one of the finest minds that Malta produced in the 19th century. And the largest funerary chapel at the Addolorata, the Messina Chapel, is to the design of Nicola Zammit. Nicola Zammit was a medical doctor, he was an architect, he was a designer, he was an art critic, he was a writer. Apart from his works in churches, there is also a work at the Addolorata Cemetery. So it is only one facet of the larger context of the decorative arts, and obviously it is an extension of the international, of the European context of the time.
Thank you, Mark. Conrad, a concluding note about the book. And
well, I hope that in a way this collective effort would create greater awareness and appreciation of the Addolorata Cemetery, to be appreciated by all of us, by all Maltese, and that this is really an integral part of our heritage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.